good afternoon. Welcome to EduCat Network. Friend, today we have another lecture on public administration. So far we have discussed the genesis of public administration, evolution, and also the various model. We have talked about the Bavarian model and also what the new thing happened in the last century and what's continuing in this century. But today our focus would be to discuss the alternative model that is being presented by the developing world countries and also by the West and World Bank and IMF. But the more focus is on accountability. So our talk will concentrate on this, and for discussion on this very topic, we have in a studio Dr. Satish Jha. He is having key interest in the public administration the world over and teaches political science in Delhi University. So I hope his knowledge and experience will help us to understand this topic, changing contour of the public administration in a new perspective. So on your behalf, I welcome Dr. Jha for the discussion on this very topic. Welcome, sir.
Thank you. In fact, in the last two parts of our discussion on changing contours of public administration over the years, we have seen that how both art of administration and the science of governance have gone together to develop a framework to, number one, to support and promote economic growth, development, and on the other hand, to ensure an equitable social order and protection and enhancement of people's rights. But as we have seen that most of these ideas have come up in Western context, as we discussed that how the founding fathers of public administration like Wilson and others were preoccupied with their own context and challenges, and therefore they worked broadly within their their own model of development and governance, and they mostly came from either Anglo-American world or French and German experiences in the continent. Now, this model itself passed through number of phases, and its evolutionary graph we have discussed that how from politics administration dichotomy to new public administration, comparative public administration, and finally this development administration discourse emerged. And after Second World War, when the third world countries were on the scene like India, I think attempt was being made to convince them that what happened in the West, the way West manages economic growth, the way the West managed and governed its society, perhaps that is the ideal type, and all these countries should try to emulate that. Now, it was of course a period of Cold War, the conflict which was going on between the two ideological camps, the Eastern and the Western. That was also one of the reference points for such discourses, as it happened not only in public administration but in different branches of social science, particularly with the rise of such approaches like behavioralism, post-behavioralism, structural functionalism, and so on and so forth. So we have seen all these developments in our last two lectures, that how Riggs and his ecological approach tried to take the discourse at a different level and try to incorporate the cultural settings of the different parts of the world, particularly third world countries, and also try to explain that much of the problems which were emerging in area of administration and governance were largely culture induced problems, because culturally these societies were different, and therefore such legal rational system, which bureaucracy is, as Weber has defined it, doesn't work properly or the way it should work within that framework. So I think all these things were there, but by the time they tried to convince these countries to follow their prescriptions, they themselves ran into series of crises and series of troubles, and therefore they themselves were in midst of new churning. They were trying to revise their own established notion, established wisdom about governance and administration. Particularly in 60s and 70s, That was particularly in case of United States of America, the Vietnamese crisis, the oil crisis, the OPEC, event, and so on and so forth. So, in fact, they were themselves in process of revisiting some of the premises on which they had based their entire discourse. But coming back to the countries like India, the developing world, I think after Second World War, when most of these countries got independence, I think they had already started their democratic journey, and in that context, they were trying to develop their own, perspective on both development and administration. For example, coming to in India, 50s, I think that is very important and crucial for understanding the last 60 years of trajectory of Indian, discourse on administration and development. Now, 50s, I think, was marked by series of measures and series of ideas, because the priorities were different. The priorities were mostly directed by, the scarcity, the underdevelopment, the needs of the people, poverty, malnutrition, undernourishment, and so on and so forth. Therefore, the growth was perhaps the biggest priority of the policymakers. But at the same time, growth had different models. Different models to achieve growth. We had the socialist model already existing in Soviet Union. We had another, similar model, trying to be implemented and operationalized in China. And at the same time, there was also a capitalist model of growth which was existing in the West. But because of our nationalist priorities, because of our constitutional goals, the Indian model had to be different from both of them, socialist as well as the capitalist market-driven model of growth. Now, how to have this? Now, this was a challenge, and the Indian policymakers tried to develop that model in the 50s, and that model was basically a state-centric model. Heavy reliance and dependence on state administration and bureaucracy. It is a different matter that this period also witnessed a very heated debate on the issue of administration and governance, that what kind of administration we should go for, administrative structure, machinery, because whatever India inherited, in terms of administrative structure, it was a colonial structure which was handed over to the Indian policymakers by the Britishers. Now, when the constitution was being drafted, this debate took place there on the floor of the Constituent Assembly, and particularly one person who defended this old colonial structure of administration was Patel, India's first Home Minister, who categorically stated that a nascent nation like India, which is trying to experiment with its democratic institutions and structure, has umpteen number of challenges, and therefore it is not proper and it will be imprudent to completely disband this administrative structure, which at one point of time constituted the steel frame of the Raj, as it was called during the colonial period. So I think Nehru was a little bit uncomfortable with this decision, because he thought that since Indian administration in the colonial period operated in a different milieu, and that was a colonial setup, and since now we are a democracy where the people's will and people's wishes have to be honored and respected, and therefore continuing with the same machinery would not be proper and fair so far as the democratic politics is concerned. But at that time, perhaps either he was not in a position to bulldoze his way, or perhaps he didn't have any clear-cut, well-developed and formulated framework that what could be the alternative of this structure. Therefore, I think that he continued with the same structure, and only the nomenclature changed. From Indian Civil Service it became Indian Administrative Service, and entire hierarchy was basically taken over by the new Indian state. Now the 50s, but at the same time, the discomfort which Nehru had initially shown for this decision, I think that got articulated and ventilated through number of ways in Nehru's policies and Nehru's priorities. For example, on the one hand, he went for planned economic growth like Soviet Union, but at the same time, this planning he tried to basically harmonize within a democratic framework, and therefore this entire Panchayati Raj institutions, which he visualized as one agency through which this planning process will be democratized. At the same time, two other measures which he formulated are equally important. One of them is the cooperative movement, which of course got derailed and didn't serve its purpose. But the idea was quite marvelous. The idea was that how in a cooperative framework, unlike the commune model of Soviet Union, this will be a democratically based framework through which people as a community can come together, as citizens can join hands and pool resources, and therefore they can supplement the efforts of the state for the attainment of economic growth and development. At the same time, his initiative to have community development program, which subsequently graduated into this Panchayati Raj institutions of the Balwant Mehta committee report came. So all these three measures in 50s were attempts in that direction. But at the same time, the reform agenda of the new state continued. Apart from this democratic channel of harnessing this administration for the cause of development, the reforming this administration within the existing framework and at the same time within the existing resources, knowledge system which was available in public administration, that also continued. Now, he formed number of committees to look into these issues, that how to streamline this administrative structure. He founded number of institutions, including Indian Institute of Public Administration in Delhi. He in fact laid the foundation, but not during his time, but subsequently Administrative Reforms Commission was also established, the first Administrative Reform Commission. Now we have the second Administrative Reforms Commission in era of liberalization and private and globalization. Now, so reform within broadly, the administrative discourse, within the existing discourse of public administration, because as we have seen in our previous lectures, that how this comparative public administration and development administration discourse were trying to prod these third world countries to go for reforms, because they thought that the main problem lies in this administrative structure which is not functioning in a third world cultural milieu, and therefore what is required is reforms. I mean, development administration required development of administration as well. So reform agenda was being pushed from that side also, but in India we find that similar attempts were being made, and therefore Nehru hired the services of a professional called Appleby, who came and submitted a report on the state of administration in India. And Appleby committee report I think constitutes an important landmark in terms of the initiative of the Indian state to streamline the Indian administration. So 50s went like this, but then the 60s you had this Administrative Reforms Commission, and Administrative Reforms Commission chaired by Morarji Desai initially, but subsequently he quit. So what happened, the Administrative Reforms Commission also came up with a number of suggestions how to streamline administration in India and to harness this administrative structure for economic growth and development. But 50s and 60s were relatively a different India altogether, because you see that was the period when the hangover of national movement was still there. People were still optimistic. A lot of hope and aspirations had been generated, but the real discontentment set in 70s. We had number of problems, the problems in terms of central-state relations, the turmoil, the people's unrest, discontentment, number of movements, peasants movement, farmers movement, workers movement, tribal unrest, a number of things. So 70s was a trying time, and that was the period when from growth the focus shifted to redistribution, and that was the period which is associated with Indira Gandhi, who was the prime minister, and he gave the slogan of Garibi Hatao. I mean, the focus shifted from Nehruvian discourse of growth to redistribution, because Nehru Mahalanobis model of development, as it is popularly called, which dominated 50s and 60s, was growth centric discourse, whereas the 70s with the Garibi Hatao and nationalization of banks and number of measures which were taken, the focus shifted to redistribution from growth. Now this redistribution, interestingly, what happened, that reposed more faith on administration and bureaucracy. Instead of downsizing it, instead of reforming the administration in a manner where in a democracy, people centric administration comes into existence, what happened that there emerged a license permit Raj, overarching state, domineering state became the central foci of the entire thing. In fact, it became the motor force of Indian development discourse. So 70s, what happened, that the gear was changed definitely from growth to redistribution, but so far as the administration and bureaucracy is concerned, there was not much difference. Rather, in fact, it was further reinforced and its power was augmented. I mean, bureaucracy and administration became the central tool to push forward this entire agenda of growth and development. Now 70s was followed by 80s, and that is perhaps the time when in the West also, so far as the discourse of public administration is concerned, was undergoing significant changes. Because the 60s, 70s, I told you, was the era of new public administration, comparative public administration, which was trying to bring administration closer to politics and attributing much of the problems to the old Wilsonian dichotomy of politics and administration, which we have discussed earlier, and then trying to study and analyze the third world countries and their administrative problem, because they thought that it was different from the Western situation. So these things were there, but 70s and 80s, particularly late 70s and early 80s, they had their own problems, and this was particularly the period of Reaganomics and Thatcherism in Britain and Reaganomics in the United States of America. And particularly, the attempt was to downsize the state, cut the state resources, state's investment, and reduce the tax burden of taxation. A retreat of a state was perhaps witnessed during this period. States withdrawal from welfare measures and so on and so forth. So basically, a new approach of administration and governance developed there. The new approach was called New Public Management approach, or in other words, one can say it was a managerial approach to governance. I mean, most of the problems were attributed to the our domineering presence of the state, and therefore the solution lies in handing over all these activities and functions to the market. And the attempt was made to professionalize this administration in the same way as the private sectors, the corporate world, manage their affairs. So corporatization of administration was the slogan in the West in 80s. And downsizing the state, and state activities were to be handed over to some non-state actors and agencies like voluntary groups, NGOs, non-governmental organizations. I think this was perhaps their new innovation, that some of the activities which the state was shouldering now should be shouldered by NGOs, the voluntary sectors, and thereby cut the expenditure which is incurred on the state and state administration. So this is the new managerial approach which was emerging in the West, and the similar managerial approach was being dished out to different countries of the world, that if they really want to tide over their own problem crisis, then they have to emulate it. And therefore, we discussed yesterday in our lecture that how Minobrook II conference was basically crucial in this respect, because this new technological variable, the communication revolution, I mean the communication technology was the new intervention, and it was believed that this could usher in a new era in the entire administrative history of the liberal Western liberal world in the West. So this new managerial, or it is called new public management approach, was market centered. It was a neoliberal approach in terms of downsizing the state, in terms of celebrating and glorifying the market. It was basically, the focus was on economic growth and productivity. Now, it was basically entrepreneur management approach to the problem. now customer friendly. It was sought to be made customer friendly, and citizens were looked at as customers, not as citizens but customers. The way the private sectors, the corporate would handle their customers, in the same way the state administration also has to handle their customers. So now the government from rowing role came to a steering role, rather a facilitator. That government's role was only a facilitator, no active proactive intervention in any activity which it was doing earlier. So I think along with this, the citizens' charters, as a clients, that charter of what are their expectations, what are their aspirations, and how administration comes to that level, these things were considered to be very important. Now, 80s, this was the period of Reaganomics and Thatcherism in the West, and the public administration was trying to toe this line. The Western discourse within public administration, the science of administration was growing, at the rapid speed and rapid pace, keeping track of the developments which was happening at the level of policies formulation. Now, policy science became a very important branch of public administration around this time. Now, this was also the period in India when we find a major shift in priorities and in terms of policies formulation. That was around 1984-85. The liberalization, people feel that started in 1980 with the second coming to power of Mrs. Indira Gandhi in the Congress, but particularly in 84-85 with Rajiv at the helm of affairs as India's Prime Minister, I think heralded this new era, which is remembered in India as computer-driven, technology-based, governance and administration slogan which he gave. At the same time, he also wanted to curb corruption, which became perhaps a folklore, political folklore in Indian context. So this, number one, taking on this corruption by giving the slogan of probity in public life, transparency, accountability, and on the other hand, more and more reliance on technology, and therefore curbing and downsizing the growing role of state and administration, which India had witnessed in 70s with this focus shifting to redistribution, Garibi Hatao, nationalization of banks, and increasing role of the state sector and the public sector. So 80s was a beginning of a new chapter in Indian alternative discourse on administration, one can say. That is 84-85. This was, in fact, in many respects, one can say it was a managerial approach to Indian problem. The same new public management approach which you have seen in context of USA and Europe, the same thing was being imitated here. This managerial professionalization of administration, and therefore the focus shifted on training, the new mode of training our personnel, new pattern of recruitment, lowering of age for induction into civil services, that younger people should be inducted into civil services who can adapt to the new challenges. Then the new education policy of 86, new education policy of 86, I mean, vocationalization of education was part and parcel of the entire thing. So I think 80s was the period of a major change, particularly 84-85 onwards. But the real change we find taking place only in 90s, and that was not a strategy-based change, but it was a crisis-driven change. And the crisis was balance of payment crisis of 90 and 91. And this was the period when for the first time India had a coalition government, a minority government led by Narsimha Rao. And this was the period when India had a finance minister and economist called Manmohan Singh, who subsequently became Prime Minister. And that period witnessed a total transformation of Indian discourse, which was trying to find out alternative to both West as well as the East. I mean, both the capitalist market-centric model of development as well as the socialist centric and state-centric model which was prevalent in Soviet Union and China at that time. So this search for an alternative was going on. Now Nehru was one such measure in direction of this quest for alternative. Now what was Nehru's alternative? We have just now discussed. Harnessing the ideas and resources which were coming both from the East and the West, both from the capitalist world and the socialist world, and then trying to dovetail it, harmonize it within the broad Indian milieu. And therefore he tried to made certain innovations, and we have discussed those innovations, that how he tried to democratize administration in the limited maneuverability which he had due to number of forces which were in operation. The feudal resistance, the resistance of well entrenched interests and classes in India, the resistance which was coming from the regional satraps within the Congress party, the regional bosses and the leaders, the resistance which was coming also from number of quarters, both within the party and outside the party. So Nehru, within that constraint, tried to experiment with his alternative. But I think that 70s, this quest took it all together in different direction, when this license permit Raj was institutionalized. And finally in 80s, the quest for alternative merged this, it completely with the Western discourse which had, emerged around that time in the West in name of this new public management approach in public administration, which we have discussed, that is a neoliberal approach in some sense of the term. Now, so 90s is in a true sense a major transformation during Narasimha Rao's premiership. Now the 90s, on the one hand you had liberalization and a structural adjustment program. Now this was occasioned due to the crisis. It was not part of any alternative or any quest for alternative which we have seen in earlier period in 50s, 60s, 70s, or to some extent it also applies to 80s. Now it was a crisis driven. India had a massive balance of payment crisis, and then what happened that India had to approach World Bank and IMF, and World Bank and IMF as a funding agencies put certain conditionalities. Those conditionalities had to be followed, and one of the conditionality was a structural adjustment program, and liberalization was part of this structural adjustment program. I mean, cutting the fiscal deficit or the fiscal management was one of the issues. The monetary policies, changes in monetary policy is another issue. So broadly a structural adjustment program comprised of all these measures. So what happened in 90s, we find this new slogan of liberalization, privatization, disinvestment. I mean the public sector which has grown manifold over the years. 70s it had become perhaps the biggest sector in Indian economy. Now the new approach was in terms of downsizing it through disinvestment programs. I mean disinvestment was perhaps the biggest priority on the agenda of the new dispensation. So liberalization, privatization, structural adjustment program, of which this was a part, was the agenda of 90s. Now at the same time, foreign investment, direct investment, all these things were promoted. So 90s, the complete transformation of Indian discourse from state centric to market centric, but at the same time it was also tried to be linked to its effectivity and its productivity and its efficiency, and it was believed that most of the problems which had emerged in Indian economy and Indian administration were largely due to over reliance on the bureaucracy and administration. And therefore if we bring the private and the public together, the two sectors together, then perhaps this can be taken care of. And therefore this 90s was a period of new perspective on administration and development in India. Now this new perspective on administration and development interestingly coincided with the new attempts which were being made by the World Bank and IMF, Indian Monetary Fund, to whom we had approached in 91-92 for bailing us out from our own crisis. I think they also came out with their new framework on administrative reforms and economic growth. Now this was put in form of good governance, good governance discourse. Now, one we have seen that is the new public management discourse which started in the West, and Rajiv Gandhi tried to to implement it in India. Now, to some extent, now this World Bank and IMF came up with another alternative, and that was a good governance. Now, World Bank, particularly in mid-90s, in their reports, extensively elaborated on this thing, that what constituted good governance. And good governance, in their opinion, didn't imply only growth and productivity, but it also implied probity, efficiency, accountability. So now the focus was not so simply on growth attainment, but also on ensuring accountable administrative order. Accountable governance was also on their agenda. So now what happened, that this new governance, a good governance discourse which they were promoting, this governance was, as a term, was replacing the old term called administration or public administration. So now the governance replaced administration. Now in this governance, it was not simply administration or a state machinery, which was the case earlier. Now this governance, as we have discussed yesterday also, had a three-layered structure. It constituted at the top the state and administration. In between, it constituted the market, and the third at the bottom, it constituted, it consisted of civil society. So three-layered, agencies for governance: state, market, and civil society. And World Bank clearly stated that good governance implied a proper combination of all three, that how all three join hands and work together, that can ensure good governance. But at the same time, this accountability issue has to be ensured at all three levels: at the level of state administration, at the level of market, and at the level of civil society. So this is something what started coming from the World Bank. But by the time India had already set out on this path of liberalization and privatization and structural adjustment, and that was also the period of globalization world over, free market. I mean, World Trade Organization had already been established in 1995. So free trade, and slogans like act locally, think globally, all these things were being given. So 90s is very crucial in understanding the trajectory of this alternative discourse in India, because we have seen the two alternatives fail, the 50s and 60s, and subsequently 70s and also 80s. Now what was this new alternative which was being worked out? Now this new alternative was not indigenous, I mean not the result of any indigenous thinking or reflection or any experience, Indian experience based alternative, but it was broadly coming from the Western sources, either in the public administration discourse which was taking place in name of new public management approach, or the World Bank and IMF. But 90s went like this, which saw many change of 3-4 governments, but also era of coalition politics. So Narasimha Rao's minority government was followed by series of coalition experiments here. I mean this Deve Gowda, Gujarat, then Atal Bihari Vajpayee, and again this UPA 1 and UPA 2 of Manmohan Singh. But 2000 onwards, India entered in altogether different situation, because most of the problems which had emerged in 50s, 60s and 70s in name of looking for an alternative, those problems were attributed to administrative dysfunctions and administrative deformities. So reform, which was attempted earlier, was considered to be inadequate. It was believed that simply reforming the administration would not do, because bureaucracy is inherently possesses a quality which basically makes it self-serving. I mean, it serves its only own interest. So it is inward looking. It loses contact with the public and the public interest, and it starts becoming the self-serving institution. From instrument, it becomes institution. It is no longer acts as an instrument of of society. It no longer acts as an instrument of a state, but it becomes institution in itself. Therefore, reform is no solution, because reform, which was thought of as a antidote to this problem of bureaucracy, was considered totally inadequate. So first Administrative Reforms Commission, a number of commissions which were instituted around that time to suggest measures to tone up the administration, to streamline the administration, was considered totally inadequate. So 90s, the attempts were made at a different level, that how to take the responsibility away from the administration and downsize it. But the this turn of this millennium, particularly since 2000 2001, different set of problems emerged, because earlier set of problems were attributed to the domineering presence of the bureaucracy. But now it was discovered that market was also not immune from those maladies. In fact, market was also leading to exclusion, market was also leading to corruption. And therefore this corporate corruption, which got exposed in recent years, added a new dimension to it. That if this managerial approach and in name of good governance, handing over responsibility to market is the only solution, then how to deal with this corporate corruption? Because this is something not only detrimental to our democratic interest, but also it is basically playing havoc with the interest of the ordinary people, the masses. And India is still, this poverty remains the biggest problem. So I think that the biggest sufferer in Indian context is those who are basically the poor, the ordinary people, the masses. Therefore, this new dimension of corporate corruption and market exclusion. But at the same time, the old problem of state administration and the corruption within a state administration continued. And at the same time, some new dimensions also increased, and that new dimension was the civil society. Because as I mentioned that in new discourse on governance, you had the three major players: state, market and civil society. So now you have exclusion at market level, exclusion at state level, and then also you have some problems coming at the civil society level, particularly this NGOization, non-governmental sectors, the voluntary sectors. Now there are many instances of corruption at their level. So I think it was believed that this new alternative which has emerged, which has not come out of our indigenous thinking or any quest for alternative, but has been crisis driven, but that has also run into trouble. So I think this 2000 onwards, India's entire experiment with this new discourse has had number of challenges. Therefore, now the quest shifted in direction of inclusive growth and inclusive governance, that how to ensure inclusive growth and inclusive government where both corruption and exclusion are tackled. So I think that number of measures were thought of, but the most significant development in recent times has been the people's movement, people's protest and the people's unrest against the existing order. Now this quest over the years has been the quest for transparency, the quest for accountability. Now I think that we have discussed here in our previous lecture also that how public administration works with a Weberian framework mostly of bureaucracy, and Weber himself cautioned again and again that this bureaucracy might lead to alienation of people, the iron cage. He also cautioned that this bureaucracy has a tendency to become self-serving institution. But this post-Weberian quest has been in direction of number A, finding a suitable democratic alternative to bureaucracy. Weber himself talked of certain measures to keep it in control, but those measures have not been successful, whether it is separation of power or checks and balances or the party system and so on and so forth. But today the quest in the post-Weberian discourse, the quest is for having a transparent and accountable order, democratic order, where the citizens and their interests are protected. not only through their participation and adequate representation, but also through an efficient and a more effective system of governance which should be put in place. So this post-Weberian quest has put a new challenge, that this bureaucracy, which has a tendency to become corrupt, which becomes self-serving institution, and therefore how to manage it within the broad democratic framework, which is liberal democracy. And in liberal democracy you have a representative democratic institutions and system. Now this is a major challenge. Now over the years, this quest for transparency and probity in public life has led to number of initiatives from the civil society. Now civil society's initiative led to the enactment of a law, that is Right to Information Act. I mean, Right to Information Act leads, or at least tries to secure a more transparent administration in the society, where the people's every decision meant for the people should be accessible to them. So it is not a top down but bottom up approach, that how people can be placed in a situation where they become active participant in governance. Now Right to Information Act and similar other measures, that is decentralization and devolution, center-state relations, the federal, new Punchi commission was established to have a second look at center-state relations and federal politics in India. After Sarkaria Commission of 80s, I think this is perhaps another major attempt to overhaul our federal structure. Similarly, you have this number of measures to take on this poverty in a more systematic and concerted manner. So you had this NREGA, National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, where individual entitlements were targeted. Then after 73rd and 74th Amendment, 72nd and 73rd Amendment, that was this 90s, when this Panchayati Raj institutions and municipal corporations were revamped, and periodic and regular elections were ensured. So devolution and decentralization, a better federal management, and then finally better empowerment of the people, so that a inclusive governance can be ensured in India, has become the modern mantra of last 10 years. But the most important issue which has stirred the conscience of the people in recent times is the issue of corruption and exclusion. And we have discussed that the earlier regime, the license permit Raj, was considered to be authoritarian, centralized, and therefore corruption based regime. But this market based governance, which has come into operation after 90s, has also not been immune from these symptoms. Therefore, how to deal with it? Now, number of measures, legal measures were taken through enactment of laws. Regulatory machineries were created, TRI and many other things, SEBI and other things, that how to have these regulatory machineries to keep the market under constant under constant vigil and supervision. But these regulatory machineries have also not been adequate to keep a complete vigil on these agencies. Therefore, this new churning of having a more transparent governance is perhaps a bigger challenge in today's India. Now, this transparency, the aspiration and quest for transparency, has witnessed in recent months a massive mobilization of people around this anti-corruption issue, and they have found a crusader in Anna Hazare, and we have seen that series of fast and a series of protests all over India, leading to the tabling of a Lokpal bill in Indian Parliament. After 40 years, when the first attempt was made in 60s during Nehru's time, and subsequently many bills came and got aborted, and finally after this pressure from the below, from the civil society, when we had a massive protest all over India against corruption and against and for a transparent administration and governance, finally government constituted a committee of civil society representatives and their own ministers, and that attempt also failed, but subsequently government came up with a bill in the parliament which is still being debated and yet to be passed. So this Lokpal attempt is in that direction, that how to have a administration which is transparent, which is accountable. But then it also poses challenges. The challenges is that India is a democracy, and India, any democracy, this representatives of the people who are elected by the people are supposed to keep a constant eye on administration, because there is a concept of legislative control on administration, that administration has to be controlled by the legislature. Now there is a concept of collective responsibility in parliamentary democracy, that collectively ministers are council of ministers responsible to parliament. But there is also concept of ministerial responsibility, that entire career bureaucrats or entire bureaucracy and all civil servants are responsible and accountable to ministers and their bosses, the political masters. Now this concept has run into a crisis, because what has happened over the years, we have witnessed that most of the corrupt practices have been witnessed, where the political bosses and the bureaucratic hierarchy, bureaucracy have come together along with certain corporate interests. So this nexus, which is perhaps becoming vicious, and that perhaps militates against the entire concept of parliamentary control on administration. So what is the alternative? Now, one alternative is being suggested is the institution of ombudsman. What Indian name is called, Indian parlance it is called Lokpal and Lokayukt. But it is not a representative body. It is a body which will be nominated or selected by those who are the representative of the people. Now there is a protest also going on simultaneously, that this institution, since not being a representative institution, it will act as a non-representative body sitting on and over this representative body called parliament. So there is a lot of apprehensions on the part of the Dalits, the OBCs, the minorities and other sections, who feel that now they are getting adequately represented in these houses, representative bodies, and therefore this is an attempt to curb their growing influence by putting a non-representative body like Lokpal over it. Now there is already discontentment against the judiciary, which is also considered to be a non-representative body. There is a discontentment against media, which is also considered to be a non-representative body. So therefore people from these sections, they believe that this is a new attempt in which, apart from judiciary and media, now there is going to be a Lokpal, a non-representative body to supervise this representative body called parliament. But this is because India is a democracy, and therefore curbing and controlling corruption within democracy is not that easy. It can be easily handled in the authoritarian system, but in democracy, where ultimately people's interests are supreme, people's opinion has to be taken, people's interests have to be factored in, I think this is a major challenge. And the remedies which are being suggested by public administration, both from the West, as we have seen, through new managerial approach, neoliberal discourse of market and downsizing the state, the World Bank, IMF driven perspective of good governance, and our indigenous attempts to have a decentralized political order, they are not coming up to that level of taking on these vices and these maladies which are afflicting our body politic. Therefore, how to have it is a real challenge, both for the policy makers as well as for the civil society and its agents and agencies. Now, civil society has come up with a number of alternatives through people's journey, through people's movement, one can say. Right to information we have already discussed, but there are a number of measures, citizens charters, etc. and etc. Now all these measures have to be looked into, but one thing is very important, that is the constitutional and legal framework of Indian democracy, which is provided by Indian Constitution. It has to be, according to the bigger, broader spirit of Indian constitutional discourse. Now, judicial activism was also some sort of a new input into entire thing, and over the years we have seen that how judicial assertiveness also led to some sort of check on these three agencies: the state, the market, and the civil society. But judiciary itself is not free from such vices. We have seen particularly the lower bureaucracy and also the middle range structure. There are instances of corruption. So already there is a talk of judicial accountability bill. But how to have these three branches of administration and executive, the legislature and judiciary in a democracy to function in a manner where they not only control and check each other, but also ensure that people's interests and citizens' rights are not only protected, but they are also empowered the way the Indian Constitution visualizes. I will stop.
Okay, you talked about the various perspective, and I also said that IMF and World Bank driven administration, and there is a third world country which are providing alternative, and also talked about the governance and good governance. But what is the exactly difference between governance and good governance? Governance, if a good governance itself is a governance.
Right.
So what is the thin line difference that people,
Because
it is just face saving of failing of the governance?
Yeah. In fact, you are right that there are two things which we have to keep in our mind. That suddenly we find that the term administration is disappearing from our discourse. Now it has started with IMF and World Bank, but it has entered into our public discourse now. Now hardly ever we are fond talking about administration. We always talk about governance. And as I have mentioned in my lecture also, that administration, when we talked of administration, we strictly confined ourselves to administrative machinery of a state, whether it is bureaucracy or whatever. The moment we changed this nomenclature and moved in direction of this governance, now we included certain other agencies apart from state machinery. And those agencies, as I have mentioned, particularly or notably, were market and the civil society. But this adjective of good governance, so far as this World Bank and IMF are concerned, they mean by good governance means accountable governance. Accountability and probity they have brought on the agenda, because they witnessed two things. That on the one hand, they were basically cajoling these third world countries to go for massive reforms in name of a structural adjustment. But the poverty situation was not improving. So they foresaw some sort of turmoil. Right? Now therefore, they thought that only antidote to their, the problems which emerged from their agenda could be, number one, probity and accountability and empowerment. So you must be finding two things simultaneously happening. One is the good governance stands for accountable governance in their discourse. On the other hand, good governance also stands for inclusive governance on the other. So inclusion and accountability, they become the key issues in this new discourse of good governance, which were not there. And it is very unfortunate that any governance which is not accountable and which is not inclusive is no governance at all. These things need not to be stated separately, but they have stated it because they could see the turmoil emerging in these societies. And of course, we have seen that last 10 years in India, whether it is in the tribal belts, the pockets, in name of Naxalism, we have seen the turmoil, we have seen the farmer suicide, we have seen the unorganized sector, the conditions in the organized sector after Arjun Sen Gupta committee report.
Yes.
That how people are living, on 20 rupees per day. And similar other things, reports are there. Even in minorities, you have the Sachar committee, documenting evidences from one minority, that is the Muslim community, that how their conditions are as bad as certain other sections like scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. But there are many sectors and many sections in society about which government has not instituted a committee, so we don't have data. But we must infer from it that conditions have not improved, rather they have deteriorated over the years.
Right.
So now deterioration, if the earlier quest for alternative failed and therefore this is the solution as you have been told, the 90s, liberalization, okay, or structural adjustment or inclusive growth, then this alternative seems to be no better. So what is the way out? And then the people's unrest we have seen in context of this anti-corruption movement picking up in different parts of the country. Right? Now Lokpal is one measure. I think after 40 years it is back on the agenda. But we have seen that now there are a lot of apprehensions about Lokpal itself.
Right.
That one monolithic centralized institution of Lokpal, whether it would be able to tackle such a massive problem.
Okay, that is fine. When we talk about the Lokpal and when it was initiated in 66 or 68,
Yeah.
we do understand something sense. But when there is already in practice social audit and other measures which has made the administration or the governance accountable to the people and people participation has become larger, in this case, to what extent the Lokpal demand or the Lokpal sort of things are essential? How
Yeah,
do you
this
assess
is also a interesting question. But you see, this social auditing which has emerged of this Mazdoor Kisans, this Rajasthan, this Aruna Roy and others, I think these measures are very healthy development. But you will notice one thing, that these measures are good enough only at micro level, the local level. The cases they have handled are mostly related to Nerega or the Panchayati Raj or local area development plans and etc. But high level corruption in high places are yet not being checked. And the recent exposure has shown that this nexus between the corporates, the bureaucracy and the political masters. Now this nexus is becoming perhaps most vicious. And therefore,
But
judicial activism.
This nexus can be broken through the different angles, different means. And what we see like now corporate and administration and politicians. So this was not in practice till 90s before the globalization.
Yeah, because corporates were not a major player.
Yeah. Now, apart from corporate, the social sector, NGOs are also a kind of they have
their own vested interest.
Yeah, they have get into the systems.
Yeah, media.
Yeah,
then another example is the media.
So this could be
right. So I think that therefore I told you the challenge is not that simple, particularly in a democracy. In authoritarian system, you can deal with these matters in a much more easy fashion. But in a democracy, where you have multiple players.
So my question is, does this Lokpal have academic value or academic importance, so that one can do a study and then only can present?
No, in fact, I will not agree with that. It has more than academic value. Okay. It has more than academic value. But at the same time, I will also add that it is not, a panacea for all ills, as it is being made out. Right? Your judicial activism played important role. Right? What you are saying that from below the kind of pressure which is emerging, social auditing or people's movement, that is another good measure.
Yes.
One institutional measure could be Lokpal, right? But how to harness all of them within a representative democratic model, where your representatives become more responsive to their voters and their constituents.
My doubt is because of that. At the time of independence, it was said democracy is panacea for
all ills. Yes.
When something happened, we move further. Then it is said that judiciary will take care of this. Let them do whatever one day they will court and the judiciary will take care. Then we came, okay, no, you make it the liberalize the rules,
economy and
make it global. The situation will be solved. then another thing, now another things.
Yeah.
So is this just a kind of
Yeah.
getting people engaged with certain moment of the time, or
No,
just
I appreciate your frustration. I think this is writ large on the faces of all Indians.
okay?
But the problem is that one thing which I should add, taking this opportunity in light of what you have asked, that the most important thing which requires our attention today is electoral reforms. Because
reforms.
entire thing we are doing in context of a parliamentary democracy. I mentioned in my lecture that there is only one check on administration and its corruption, that is the parliamentary control on administration. Lokpal is simply adjunct to it,
Okay.
right? So much so that in New Zealand it is called parliamentary commissioner,
Okay.
right? Now, because of this disconnect between representatives and their constituents, I mean the elected representatives and the people, most of the problems are emerging. So unless you have electoral reforms in place, I think these measures would not be able to
So
deliver.
the last question I would like to ask you, then what is the core of electoral reformation, electoral reform?
Core of electoral reforms twofold I would emphasize. Most of the proposals which have been given by Law Commission and Election Commission, they look at the situation before a ballot is cast.
Okay.
Voting machine, electioneering, campaign, manifesto, etc. My focus would be on post-election scenario. That what happens after ballot is cast, next 5 years, the accountability of representative towards people after they are elected,
Okay.
till the time they go back to them for next election. In this period, what kind of responsiveness and accountability are there? Perhaps this can ensure a more accountable political order for any democracy.
Okay.
So this should be on the agenda.
So well friends, with this we conclude the lecture. I thank all of you for watching the lecture, and on your behalf I thank Dr. Satish Jha for enlightening us with this sort of discussion, and also with examples which are relevant and that make us to understand the real problem and what could be the solution. So with this we again thank all of you. Thank you very much.